Good evening. Our last speaker is approaching, so we can start. We welcome you today at our today's discussion about the protest movements in Europe, and I'm happy to announce that this is another event which is part of the School of the Abducted Europe, which is one of the schools, 6 schools of the Kyiv Biennial, the School of Kyiv 2015. The School of Abducted Europe is co-organized by the Center for Visual Culture in Kyiv and the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna. I will introduce our moderator today, and he in turn will introduce the speakers. Wojtek Przybylski is president of the board of the Respublika Foundation and editor-in-chief of Eurozine. He became editor-in-chief of Eurozine this year, succeeding Karl-Henrik Fredriksson, who was speaking here earlier in September in the framework of the School of Abducted Europe. Wojtek's interests involve intellectual history and political philosophy, with focus on cultural and religious ideas of the 19th and 20th century, as well as political and cultural revolution of the digital age. He previously worked as a research assistant at the Erasmus Chair at Warsaw University, where he organized various events, including Tischler debate in cooperation with the IWM in Vienna. Wojtek writes for Polish and European media, namely for Eurozine, for Gazeta Wyborcza, for New Eastern Europe, Gospodarcze Nowiny. Okay, I stop here.
Thanks so much, Tatiana. In turn, I could just welcome Marіі Tомак, whom you all know very well. She's a human rights activist and reporter from the conflict area, among others. She was working for Dzień, long time ago, and everything else in the bio you can find online. Paweł Marczewski is the head of publications for the Institute of Human Sciences, and I believe he had appeared here on several occasions already. So, no further ado, but Paweł has a PhD in sociology. We've known each other for a long time as well, discussing political ideas and especially international theory, I believe. And Vasilyl Cherepanyn is an old friend, and how much should I tell about Vasyl? You all know him, and I'm very pleased to be at the same table and discuss. As Vasyl is pretty much the host next to IWM of the event. Guys, we agreed with Marina that you speak first. With you too. What is the sense of comparing? Is there a sense? Is there a reason to compare protest movements? Paweł, would you just give a rationale? Why is it important? Why may it be important?
Well, the idea for the panel originated basically when I saw that there is a book entitled Maidan Tahrir, that when certain when the Arab Spring revolutions broke out in different countries of the greater Middle East, there was a lot of talk in Poland about how Arab Spring resembles solidarity movement in the 80s, but there were very few occasions on which I could hear an informed discussion or read an analysis comparing movements in Eastern and Western Europe, or more broadly Western Hemisphere. And I do believe it's a gap that needs to be filled, because if you take this European component of Maidan, it would be only natural to look at protests in countries of Western Europe, or protests that broke out in other countries of the European Union. For example, there was a major protest in Bulgaria, which happened just a couple of months before Maidan broke out, and of course it wasn't as violent, it wasn't as all-encompassing as Maidan was, but still it was a major social protest that has shaken the foundations of the whole society in Bulgaria. And some of the arguments that were made by protesters were quite similar to certain demands that were voiced during Maidan, and that are still being voiced in both countries. And on the other hand, you have all social movements in Eastern Europe, protest movements, using the repertoire of symbols and gestures and mobilization techniques that were already tried out in Western Europe, for example during the Occupy movement, both in London, in New York, as well as by Spanish indignados. So if there are some superficial similarities in mobilization techniques, symbols, and so on, it could be, in my opinion, interesting to try to see whether there are any deeper similarities between these protest movements. For example, when it comes to the use of violence and attitude towards using violence, whether it would be whether there are some similarities when it comes to certain ideological affiliations or ideological attitudes in these movements. So, for example, whether you could say that all these protest movements are, in a certain sense, left-wing movements because they are because they are grassroots movements which are trying to sort of defy and break older social hierarchies. Or it's entirely not true, and there is a deep division between Eastern and Western Europe. Eastern European movements are maybe more right-wing or more center-right in many, many respects, while, for example, Occupy movements and indignados are more openly left-wing. And last but not least, an interesting question, in my opinion, would be to see whether this Eastern and Western European protest movements have certain potential for creating political parties, or if not political parties, maybe more organized political institutions, which would be then able to change the political scene. There are certain political parties originating from new social movements and protest movements in Western Europe, Podemos, for example. While we don't see that many, or almost none whatsoever, political parties and more sort of traditional institutions originating from protest movements in Eastern Europe. And I guess it's a distinction that is worth exploring in greater detail, and this hasn't been done, at least not to my knowledge. So these are big questions that we would like to at least partially try to answer tonight.
Let me turn to Vasyl. You were just like many of you. You were simply on the streets. You're part of the protest movement. I'm sure you've been discussing that already. But do you feel yourself in need of comparison, or is it unique in itself? The experience you have had on Maidan, and is it somehow needed for Ukraine to now, is it already the time to withdraw and analyze back using comparison and methods, and can you do it by yourself?
Yeah, thank you for your question and for having me here. Unfortunately, as I told yesterday, I'm not a sociologist, so for me it's hard to sort of to make a theoretical, sociological sort of style backup for my thoughts and ideas. So that's why, like, my perspective I can share with you is either a personal one or somehow institutional one, and I don't have another position, right? So, I mean, it's also important for me somehow to define what is the place from which I'm speaking now, right? Also, even here on this forum. So I think that it's absolutely valid, and yeah, you mentioned Maidan Tahrir book, which was actually published by the Visual Culture Research Center, which is a political critique in Ukraine. And this kind of intention which lies behind the book, I would say that it's not intended on that kind of comparison that you are trying to propose. For sure, a lot of dimensions and layers of these protests that emerged like during last years, they have a lot of in common. And it's very important, really, especially in Ukraine, which is regarding the media field still, if you perceive it from outside, it looks like an island. Yeah? So it's very closed, very narrowed. It's really very important to broaden the perspective and yeah, to inscribe Maidan in the current texture of political life of the world. But at the same time, we have also to be aware of what is yeah, some specificity, or what are the measurements or the boundaries of the phenomena that we are trying to compare, because first of all, the idea to have Maidan Tahrir actually, well, as for me, doesn't mean that you can compare Maidan with Occupy or like with Indignados and so on. Well, you can, like, on some literal level, in the meaning of the words, that Maidan was quite the opposite to Occupy, because it was a real occupation of the whole downtown, right? But Occupy was just had some time frame where it like stayed in the center of the city, but Maidan never gave up the square itself. Yeah? So it was rooted like in a physical sense, in a material sense. That's why barricades and all this stuff. But actually, Maidan Tahrir is like an intention. It's another vocabulary, or another like a new word for agora or forum, right? Like it's a like indicator that today we see some uprisings or social turmoils which are like getting back to the physical urban central square, which is becoming more intensively the center of politics. So it's not the parliament, not the professional field of politics, but the square. And somehow I think it's if we analyze it as a symptom, just not comparing with different movements, we see that on the very basic level, that's the intention somehow to go back to the roots of democracy, because the current instruments which are so established and well working in the Western world are more and more destructive, especially here. And that's the way, or somehow claiming for some transformation, right? And different ideas can be claimed, but nevertheless, in all these, be it Tahrir or Syntagma or Maidan or Puerta del Sol, but it's always the square. Yeah? So I mean, for me, it's important methodologically. Yeah? I mean, politically, from a methodological point of view, but not on this, because from that perspective, that like to my mind, I'm not professional here. That my colleague proposed, I wouldn't call Maidan itself as movement. Of course, in some like very direct sense, it was a movement, because the people were somehow like it was whirling and it was like boiling and so on. But it was not a movement in this kind of protest movement like you have in sociology, or you can call like indignados, because these kind of movements they have some awareness, and Maidan was much more deep, as for me, much more fundamental, much more profound, because it claimed much more basic antagonisms than these movements are pretending to do.
Sorry, once again, this last sentence, could you explain these antagonisms? I didn't get it.
Yeah. Well, because Maidan was actually, it's not a movement, it's rather uprising, so I wouldn't like pose the question that whether it was possible or not to create such circumstances for Maidan to be transformed into the party or into some initiative, because it's like because if you have movement or party or whatever institution, it's rather about what is in German called Gemeinschaft. Yeah, but Maidan is Gesellschaft, it's society as a whole. So it's too big, too much for the movement. It can contain lots of movements.
Basically, to put it in brief, it was questioning the whole system, the whole political and social arrangement, rather than trying to improve it, as other social movements usually try, right? Within the framework, if you compare it, I don't know, to the black movements under Martin Luther King or whatever, then it was referring to the political social structure.
Probably to put it really short way, that like Maidan faced it had multi phases, different stages and developments, but on the very basic level, Maidan as a political phenomenon faced really very existential and basic or even sub-political issues, not just on the level of superstructure or even on the economical level, like all the political movements usually are dealing with. Because it's the question of life and death, it's the question of physical survival, that's the question of violence, how you deal with that, that's the issue of when you have people and you have repression. So really, probably it's very primitive, right, or naive, but it's important because it's basic. That's what I mean. Yeah.
Okay, Maria, I will ask you now. I've seen you've been noting down, but I would ask you to specifically bring this topic of, human rights perspective. How much the perspective of human rights was in this multifaceted and multidimensional Maidan? How was it important from your point of view? Because obviously you're focused on these human rights. Or again, maybe this was just too little to show the whole picture of Maidan.
Thank you. Actually, I think that human rights is the core element of Maidan itself in general. And if to go back to the beginning of all the events, from the first days, I remember, probably other people who attended Maidan remember it as well, one of the most popular phrases was human rights above all. Right. So, and actually, it was one of the things which was noticed, for example, by Timothy Snyder, and I'm really thankful for him for that, is that this was not noticed, this idea and this agenda of human rights above all was not noticed, for example, by lots of European left-wing organizations and so on, because of, as we all know now, Russian propaganda, which is very much powerful. And of course, this issue of human rights became even more important after the great violence, which started on the 30th of November and which continued on the 1st of December, and then political prisoners, and then other different events. And actually, I think that Maidan is about human rights, is about the problem of violence, the problem of relations between the human and the state, which is very much Soviet style now. And from that perspective, I would compare the movements and the uprisings and the revolution, however you call it, in the post-Soviet space. Firstly, with Russian White Stripes movement, Белоленточное движение, so-called, and with Bolotnaya Square. And if you will try to analyze the events of Maidan, you will see very clearly that actually Yanukovych guys was trying to apply very similar like Russian scenarios in Maidan. But the problem is that reaction was completely different than in Russian society. For example, when there was an awful crackdown on protesters on the 1st of December of 2013, and after that we had first 12 political prisoners, there was a huge reaction of people. Probably 1 million of people appeared on the streets, and we began to monitor all the court hearings, and by the way, media as well. So it was a huge importance, that attention, that very strong reaction of the society to this violence. So, and if just to go back a bit earlier to the events which was before Maidan, we had a very important thing which was called Vradivska Hoda. It was a reaction of the society again on the police violence in Ukrainian province. So, and by the way, Ukraine is one of the leader in police violence, like in Europe. So that's a very sad thing. And actually, this problem existed all the time, but during Maidan, it was too obvious. That's why people reacted very much. And I think that I totally agree with Vasyl that the main thing also about Maidan, that it was the issue of survival. It wasn't about some utilitarians, about the cost of, like warm or like energy or anything else. It was indeed about the survival. And especially, we were discussing yesterday the issue of violence. The violence on Maidan started after the so-called dictatorship law was adopted, which just cancelled all the basic freedoms of human rights and freedoms. I mean, it was an attempt to make the state of emergency just like that, and that was partly what caused the further escalation of the violence. And yes, and I think that the same motive was in Russia, in Bolotnaya Square, but unfortunately here we have the very obvious difference between Russian and Ukrainian society is not the fact that it was the violence, but the fact how people were reacting on the violence. And very significant thing is that riot police representatives, which was making that violence, they fled to Russia, and now they are like working in Oman in Russian riot police, and they feel okay. And last thing, probably because I think that the state violence is a very important element of Maidan and all of the revolutions or anything happened in post-Soviet space, is that actually very important now to hear and to be presented on the court hearings regarding the Maidan crimes. And when you hear, for example, policemen, how do they justify their actions? You understand that it's a totally Soviet-style mentality in which law enforcement is not actually law enforcement, but it's a punishing. Yes, it's an instrument for repression. So that is what I think was Maidan against, and that is why it was the way to survive. And last thing is, I liked very much this Somebody among the Russian, by the way, journalists called Maidan, when it all just started, the second anti-Soviet revolution. I think that's a very, very good description of what was Maidan. But of course, it's still there. I mean, Maidan, but on the other level.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And what I have in mind is this question about, well, obviously there's room for comparison. And I was drawing the parallels or potential parallels to the events of protests happening more or less in the same time frame all around the world. But at the same time, the other argument is that there is room for comparison, but not on the let's say on the general landscape in the same time frame, but more, as Maria is now trying to portray it, it's more coming deeper into time frame of the past. So you can refer to different anti-Soviet protests. That's just, I think that just brings a depth to the potential of making comparison and making some understanding. And for sure, to me, I mean, I am greatly appealed by the distinction. It is about dignity, but is there any? It's all about dignity, human rights, dignity. This is all that we could attribute to the Václav Paweł times, his writings, and different other events that has happened over the last 30, 40 years in the region. But Paweł, how do you see this issue of dignity in other protest movements? Is it not there? What the other non-Maidan movements? Is it something that escaped? I mean, how do you agree simply with drawing these different types of parallels?
Yeah, I mean, from the inside, I guess every social movement and every revolution looks unique. And if it's looked upon from the outside, certain parallels and similarities arise, and this is by no means meant to undermine the achievements or to sort of denigrate or somehow belittle the incredible outburst of social energy that Maidan was. This, in fact, I mean, if you try to spot the similarities and track them, it in fact can become another tool for inspiring protests in different parts of the world, just like it was during the Arab Spring, when an outbreak of social protests in one country inspired outbreaks of social protests in other countries. When Maidan happened, I was still in Sofia. It was shortly after the protest movement was slowly beginning to die out. And I remember discussing, I mean, people in Sofia, I mean, the intellectuals that I talked to spoke about nothing else. They spoke only about Maidan. And their point was, I mean, why we were not able to do something similar? I mean, why did we not manage to finish our revolution if it was revolution from the very start? So they were incredibly interested. They were following it very closely. This like overnight became experts, for example, in a situation of Bulgarian minority in the Ukraine. So there was an incredible interest there. So just I would like to stress this very, very strongly, that looking for similarities is not meant to belittle or sort of take this uniqueness of the social movement, but it can be also a potential for or an inspiration for social movements elsewhere, and it also is meant to help main actors of the social movement or revolution understand themselves. And coming back to the question about dignity and these parallels between social movements that are inspired or that stress the importance of human rights, I mean, of course, the question of dignity was absolutely crucial in the Arab Spring. I mean, the first outbreak in Tunisia, of course, was from the very first day meant to be defense of the dignity. I mean, if you remember what was this, well, small when compared, to the global scale, act of violence that inspired Arab Spring in Tunisia. So this self-immolation of a street vendor who was offended who was beaten up by the police who wanted to extort a bribe from him. And then he burned himself in front of the police station, one of the smaller towns in Tunisia, right? It's very small, but it inspired a huge social movement all over the country. And the main slogan, not the slogan, if you can call it a slogan, the main thing that they were demanding was dignity, bring back dignity. The same, sorry?
What did it lead?
This is another question. I'm all too happy to discuss it, and I was, but this is another stage, absolutely. But we're talking about the origins now. I mean, what was the most important thing for the protesters? What mobilized them? What basically inspired their imagination? The same you can basically say about Egypt, and of course the consequences are. I would love to discuss them later on. If you look at social movements like, for example, Solidarity movement in Poland, it would be impossible without dignity. Without the concept of dignity. Of course, you have this highly religious concept of dignity from the Catholic Church, which was, of course, deeply embedded in the dissident movement in Poland. But you also have a purely secular notion of dignity and human rights in the final agreement of the Helsinki Conference in the mid-70s. And this would be impossible. Solidarity movement would be impossible without the Committee for Solidarity with Workers, and the Committee for the Solidarity with Workers in the 70s would be impossible without the Helsinki Conference. So all of a sudden you have this concept which basically enables the dissidents to bring this conflict to another level, a level at which it is much more difficult for the authorities to challenge them. So I see a lot of similarities there on the front of human rights. So it would be deeply misleading to say that only Maidan and Bolotnaya Square were about dignity when you take a look at recent protests. Students who occupied the university in Sofia also said that they are demanding dignity, that they finally want to be, they don't want to be ashamed of their country anymore. That they want to sort of regain their dignity. Those were the phrases that they told me when I went to interview them when they started occupying the university. And coming back also to what Vasyl said, when he said that Maidan was basically society, as Germans say, inclined for Format, right? So this is like a model of society. Every social group, every political ideology was represented there. So was Occupy and the Indignados. When I was in Barcelona, when the Indignados movement was taking over the main square of the city, you could find people who were, like hardcore left-wingers from the Franco times. There were students who were basically, making very general, vague claims, but they made up for it with their enthusiasm. You had community organizers from different districts of the city. So you also had a society, a model of society, a small model of society there. And if you look at the Occupy movement, what was, I think, the most remarkable thing about the Occupy movement was not its, symbolics, which was later on adopted by other social movements all over the world, for example, in Israel. But what was really remarkable about it was that people from the middle class, and most specifically graduates of prestigious universities who are sort of like fuel for this protest, especially in New York, that they built an alliance, they managed to build an alliance with trade unions, which hasn't happened in American politics, I think, for the last 20 years. And here we also have different social interests, different social groups coming together. So I guess, of course, Maidan is unique in many respects, but at the very deep level of dignity and representing the whole of society, it's not as unique at all. And it is not a bad thing that it is not unique.
I would like to come back to what Vasyl was just saying. a moment ago about Maidan being very basic. It was at certain moments about life and death, or at least your health. It was about well-being, to the extent to which many of the protest movements that we've been mentioning in the very beginning cannot be compared, because no such amount of violence has been used against the unarmed citizens. So in a sense it reflects or resonates the ideas of Sorel, for instance, from the 19th century on how much violence has been important for the purification, for the sense of sacred moments, for the change in the society. And I think, I don't think anything. I would like to hear a little bit from Vasyl on that point. But also on the second point, when you were mentioning the book, both of you were mentioning the book of Natalia Gumeniuk, the Maidan Tahir, and I had just a quick encounter with her talking about the book, and she said she would not perhaps write it again because there was nothing to search for, in the sense that she was looking for the comparisons. And she did not find in Tahir Square anything that could be compared to Maidan, because Maidan was built about building something new, some new imagined political reality. These two points, Vasyl and then Maria and Paweł, in that order, please. Could you reflect on both, on the question of violence, how violence is important for the changing, for making the situation unique and really a breakthrough. And it's not a value judgment, but it's an observation how much it's important. And then, secondly, this is the question of, so many protest movements are about protesting. They're celebrating protests itself. How much do you find from this difficult perspective today? How much do you see this capacity to aspiration to do something?
Yeah, thank you. It's really, I think, one of the most crucial and defining points or basic stones of not just only, it's not only the issue of the protests in general, but any kind of political action. I'm really very interested in violence. I mean, also personally and in general, theoretically, I think it's one of the biggest mysteries in political philosophy, like power and violence, two main issues as for me. You see, if you are like putting the question you did, it's a bit, as for me, misleading path, because Marcuse, it seems to me, Marcuse claimed that if revolution wants to win, it has to be capable to minimize violence, to be to economize violence, So if you make violence your main stake, you are just lost. It's the worst thing you can ever imagine, or any kind of movement can propose in the public sphere, because if you retrospectively look back at the protests and movement that happened in the 90s, for example, in the Seattle people, ultra-globalist movement, or afterwards what happened in Geneva and this radicalization, clashes with police, it became really let's destroy McDonald's and so on. So it really works, but it's very dangerous, because the main problem with violence is that it has a virus nature. So it doesn't matter who uses it, but once it appears in any kind of context, it somehow contaminates everything. Every kind of subject is present there. So it's finally, if you are not aware of it, if you are not ready for violence, So it means that you are lost, right? So it's so nothing, no matter to pretend that you are making the revolution, right? If you are not ready to deal with violence, if you don't know how to rule it. So because it's really very dangerous to find yourself in a sort of desert around, yeah? when everybody is like paralyzed, and violence is really like on the level of form even. Is very dangerous because when it comes to the social sphere, it somehow enables other possibilities. It narrows the choice. So that's why I can say that from this point of view, yeah, being aware of this complexity, I'm also speaking like both about individual violence and structural violence and political violence. From this point of view, I think we can name the Maidan the revolution itself, because you see one of the like symptoms or one of the like hints that you have a revolutionary situation is the appearance of such circumstances in which, if you don't use violence by yourself, it would cost more violent situation, even much more than it used to be. So somehow the revolutionary situation demands from you, like if you are a political subject, yeah, acting in this context. So it demands, it requires from you to use violence. If you don't do this inaction creates more violence from the other side, right? So that's why it's better not to go to this point, right? I am totally skeptical about violence. So I think that it's the worst weapon ever. Yeah, but there are moments when you are obliged to do that, if you really take it seriously, right? And the revolutions are about taking seriously, yeah, the reality.
Just to be precise, it's about being confronted with violence, or to be taken seriously as a revolutionary, you need to be even ready to use violence.
Yeah, sure, ready to use violence. Otherwise, you see, otherwise it would be like a dead end. You wouldn't rule out of it. So because you see, if you look at like the developments of Maidan, there was more or less clear that actually the grade of violence was constantly growing. Constantly. So it's like in the famous saying, if you have a gun in the piece, it would anyway somehow act. Yeah. So this violence was growing on both sides. And the problem of Maidan people and of Maidan as political phenomenon, that Ukraine was of course totally unprepared for that. It's really very hard to be prepared for violence, yeah? Because even all those so-called and brave self-defense of Maidans, all these hundreds, in the crucial moments they really disappeared. So and that is a moment which indicates who can pretend, who can be a political subject there. Yeah? Only a collective one. Only those who decided, just for some reason, really, it's like a miracle. Yeah? Decided to stay, and that is the moment when it comes to the real body politics, right? That that you use your body as a last weaponry, that is violence. Yeah, that's the difference between power and violence, which is power is always distant and violence is always near and like direct. It acts on your senses. Yeah, and that's why there were some people there, but nobody was prepared.
Human rights is the big story of rise of human rights is usually connected with the movements and the protests, where you see people sacrifice themselves, but they refrain from using violence. Just the opposite of we've just heard from Vasyl. You think of you think of India. You think, after all, solidarity. You think of of Selma, of Martin Luther King's. All of that has been built on a bit different approach. Now, how do you think this use of violence by illegitimate, in a sense, crowd of people on Maidan was legitimate in the light of human rights? And one more important question for me also is why this has happened, and what has happened that group of 500 Ukrainian students on December 2nd resisted and stayed and decided to be beaten and resisted, while not long ago, maybe you don't need to make this comparison, but I would just like to point that in 2010 there were 50,000 people on the squares of Minsk after presidential elections, and it took just one guy to break a window and everybody disappeared.
I just wanted to make a correction a bit because actually the violence on Maidan from the side of protesters was not a reaction on the violence of the state and law enforcement, because actually the first reaction on the violence from the side of law enforcement was the bigger protest, but it was peaceful. After the crackdown on student Maidan, it was peaceful. After the appearance of first political prisoners, it was still peaceful. During the whole December, it was peaceful. During the half of January, it was peaceful. But then, when this dictatorship law, so-called, appeared, that was one of the factors. And the second factor, that indeed people felt that there is no potential of political resolution of the situation. They just saw it, and they felt it. And just recalling my memory that day, the 16th of January, when the violence actually started, I thought that, to be honest, I thought that it was provoked by some group, of radicals. But then I saw how medical staff was taking care about people who are not looked at all as some radicals or marginals. That was I would say golden youth, so-called, and I was very surprised by that. And I felt that there is something new for Ukraine and for Maidan itself, and that it is not a provocation, that it is a development of the situation. And I would like to point out that in terms of human rights, since it is always relations between people and the state, I think that it was a fault of the state which used the violence, and they got a reaction. Actually, it's their responsibility of Yanukovych, Zakharchenko, and all that company. And one more important thing about the violence which was used by Maidan is that it was not very large-scale violence. It was but it was targeted towards the law enforcement, who really used the violence. You just can, maybe you remember that there was a monument which was covered with some, with some plastic bags, just not to be disturbed, and there was no, people were not robbing, Maidan protesters, any shops or anything. They were just fighting against the police. And of course, there was about 30, if I'm not mistaken, there was 18 policemen dead after those events, and now it is investigated, by the way, by prosecutor's office. I'm not sure if someone will be brought to justice in that regard, but still I think that the Maidan was quite patient, so it wasn't like violence right away, There was a long time which passed till it started actually. And of course, I agree again with the colleagues that it's like a snowball when it started, especially after the first killing of on Maidan of Armenian guy. It was clear that it will end up with a big blood. And as for the second question of building something new, I think it's a very interesting topic to discuss, why Maidan did not result in any large-scale movement, social movement, I mean like solidarity, for example, because there was an idea on Maidan itself to establish something like political party or something more bigger, but the problem is that even that small group of young politicians, they did not manage to create even their own political party. They were dispersed among other old, these awful old oligarch clans, and now they are taking part in. I don't think that they are all bad or something, but it's a phenomenon that they were not capable of creating, or we were not capable of creating something new, which would propose to the society new agenda. And now you can see, now we have the elections very soon, the local elections, and you can see again the story not about the competing of ideas, but the competing of political projects which are financing by the same people. And I think that's the problem, but it can be also understood if you will look back to year 2004 and Orange Revolution, because Orange Revolution did not even result in the new blood in government bodies. Now, at least we have some new people in different state structures, and that makes me be optimistic. And the last thing is about the violence. I'm very much afraid and concerned about the talks on Third Maidan, because if it will happen now, it will be really a bloody mess, because lots of weapons, lots of radical moods, and of course it will not be with this Gandhi agenda at all, I'm afraid.
While we discuss further, I'm opening the floor for comments and questions from your side, so just raise your hands. I'll be looking for your interventions. But perhaps Paweł, you want to react? If not, there is to violence questions, or not, then...
Just a very quick reaction to the question of violence. It would be very, very difficult to actually find a movement or a revolutionary situation which would be totally non-violent. Even if you look at India, which we normally usually associate with Gandhi and Satyagraha and non-violent movement, it was not only a question of communal strife between the Hindu and the Muslims. Even before that, there are large sections within the Congress, for example, which were much more militaristic than Gandhi. Of course, it doesn't take much to be more militaristic than Gandhi, but there are actual militant groups, and you of course have a very long tradition of left-wing violent radicalism in India, dating back at least to Bhagat Singh, who was hanged for killing officials of the Raj, and you have a civil war going on in India as we speak. I mean, there are large sections of the country where you have militarized Maoist militias, sometimes politically aware, sometimes they're just composed of people who became radicalized because they were so extremely impoverished and that they just couldn't take it anymore. But if you look, for example, at Western Europe, and this is a very interesting case, you had the so-called London riots a couple of years back. I guess you all remember that, which came as a total surprise to a lot of people in the UK. And there was a major study conducted after it finished by LSE and journalists from The Guardian. And basically it turned out that in many respects violence was used by people who just lacked political agenda but felt that they don't have a voice, that they don't have a political voice. And there are similar cases in the West, for example in Sweden, which we came to associate with stable social democracy. But you had, for example, cases of burning cars on a massive scale in one of the affluent Swedish cities by Swedish citizens of different origin, Asian origin. So you have sometimes acts of violence which are meant to be a way of appropriating political voice. But of course, if you don't have a political agenda, if you don't have any way of organizing yourself before you actually take to violent means, it ends in bloody mess, as Maria said. So I'm very much in agreement with Vasyl when he says that if you make violence your main cause, or if violence substitutes for the lack of political cause, then of course you're lost. You're lost as a political activist. You're lost as a social organizer, and of course you lose because you cannot win a confrontation like that. So yeah, I guess that's that.
Just shortly to add a couple of things. So first of all, we are using the term violence as if there is one homogeneous violent phenomenon we are speaking about. Of course, violence is so different as politics is. So it has to be every time defined precisely and contextualized what kind of violence, in which circumstances, who is the subject, who is the object. So violence also sort of relationship. Yeah. So and it has to be analyzed also in terms of its components and its context. Yeah. So there are different kinds of violence because that is actually a speculative argument. The so-called Kremlin propaganda is, or rather the Russian-waged media war is based on, that somehow the key point for their discourse, especially abroad, and first of all, of course, on the post-Soviet space, is that, like, look at Ukraine, look at Maidan, it provokes war immediately. That's the main result of making revolution. Come on, like keep distance from that. So it's really, I mean, as if you have violence, you will unavoidably get some warfare results, which is of course a total speculation. It's not the case. So that is a problem. That revolutionary violence, which was on the Maidan, somehow forcefully there. Because and that was a problem, you know, that people at some extent, even in January, still were not ready and were not capable of grasping the issue. Yeah? They were not really projecting somehow their situation for the following weeks. So they were not ready for that. That's why it was so bloody. Yeah? Probably we wouldn't have so many killed people if the main stakeholders who were keeping the square were aware of that. So when you have a revolutionary violence on Maidan, and then you have a warfare, that these are actually two contradictory phenomena of violence. They are actually fighting with each other. Because the violence that Maidan experienced was even, so to say, wiping out all the violent a prioris the Ukrainian society had been based on. Because before Maidan, if you take into account also this context, the only political force which was had a copyright on violence was the far right. And the Maidan violence appeared to be the best antidote against far-right violence. Because if you, as a typical fascist, you see microphone is not working when I'm saying this word. When the fascists as a political force were specialized in that, right? Violence is their aim. So that was their radical chic to propose to the streets, to young groups and so on. They were mobilizing people like hooligans, but the level of violence that ordinary people experienced on Maidan, it was so unprecedented for Ukrainian society that it totally kicked out the far-right violence as an idea, because you cannot compare to this kind of intensity of violence. So that's why the main result regarding this issue after Maidan was that the far-right were totally marginalized, and the presidential elections are actually there in May 2014, right? Is the best example for that. Like altogether, like approximately 3%. But what brought them back actually was the war, and that is the case. You can use violence as a tool to fight another violence. So, but it doesn't mean that that there is any kind of innocent position. So if you are in the political field, if you are on the square, so if you are pretending in some strategy, you anyway have to be aware that there will be a moment that you will be obliged to use it. And that is also the adultness of the political subjectivity, right?
I'm opening the floor for questions and comments. If you like, just please raise your hand. It's indeed a fascinating topic, fascinating discussion. I'm not sure I agree completely with what you're saying that it's against the Ukrainian history to use violence, the uprisings, whatever forms of political violence have been used. But indeed, I think it's very interesting to say this was anti-Soviet to use violence by the people, because the citizens in the Soviet projection are very peaceful subjects. They are completely pacified. They're not really citizens. They are subjects of some politics, but they're not citizens in the sense that they're not fully in control of the situation they're making. So in what you were saying, it's striking to me at least that again this appearance of people being beating back, being killed, blood on the street, the visual image. I myself was simply glued to whatever online TV was there. This was changing it was making the whole process completely different and anti-Soviet. That's hard to imagine. It's hard to remember for me anything like that in any of the Soviet space. If there was occurrence, then it was later very much suppressed.
Not only in the Soviet space, also around.
Yeah. Okay.
I have a question. I will start with a comment and then formulate my question. So there's some kind of commonplace, meanwhile, in publications about protest movements, that they are kind of borrowing from each other in terms of forms of protests and instruments used in some kind of stylistic. Yeah. So in our institute we had recently a presentation by Ivail Dichev, who studied like protest movements, and it looked almost like he demonstrated how much they borrowed from each other in terms of language of protests. Yeah. At the same time, I don't know. I have some kind of feeling that we have like new protests emerging in let's talk about the post-Soviet space. There was this Electric Yerevan. Just recently we had protests in Chisinau. So I don't know how many of people who went to the streets in Yerevan actually being angry about the government and with their own demands, how many of them still thought that the protests in Ukraine were paid by the American government, for example. So my question would be about the hermeneutics of protest movements. Are they able really to kind of communicate, or it's just a kind of mimicry, and they are completely like hermetic towards each other, or is it possible to find some kind of common denominator? So is it this learning is just about the forms of protest, or some kind of basic solidarity is also possible, which goes beyond the national borders?
So in other words, is Putin right to be really afraid of Maidan because it can transform Russia?
Yeah, this is one of the implications maybe of my question, but I'm just wondering if these protests are just like isolated phenomena which have maybe some similarities, but they are not necessarily able to communicate with each other. Like,
this is an absolutely crucial question. I mean, just to follow up on this hypothetical example that you gave, whether people in Yerevan still believe Putin's propaganda about Maidan. When the protests in Sofia broke out, there was a group of activists from Romania who came to Sofia to communicate with this revolutionary students occupying the university, because they were hoping that they will be able to build a certain connection, or a network maybe even, between Bulgaria and Romania, because this was more or less exactly the same time when the Russia-Montana protests broke out in Romania. They were protesting against buying of land from farmers and starting fracking. So there were huge American companies which were buying land in Romania with the approval of the government, and there was a group of activists which was protesting against it. But nothing came out of it. I mean, no one... it's not that they did not want to talk to these people. They just didn't have any way of communicating. They just didn't see how their interests or their political demands may be related to Romania. And of course, the fracking issue is extremely touchy in this part of Europe, because of course Russian interests are involved. There was some attempt to start fracking in Bulgaria, and all of a sudden overnight you had new NGOs who were protesting against it, and almost all of them were sponsored by Russia. So, and if students at the Sofia University are making claims that we should sort of free our country from this informal influence of Russia, of Bulgarian oligarchs selling themselves to the Russians, in many segments of the economy, then you can see that these fights could be somehow connected. I mean, if you don't build a solidarity network with Romanian activists, they will accept money from Kremlin, and they will win their fight by other means. For example, I mean, this is a hypothetical situation, but I guess it points out the necessity of creating such networks of solidarity. And another Bulgarian example, which is quite interesting, is that all these students were using, the symbol of the clenched fist. They were calling themselves Occupy and so on. But at the same time, a lot of them were making claims which would be absolutely unacceptable for the Occupy activists in the West. For example, there was this spontaneous committee for the reform of electoral right. electoral code in Bulgaria. And I spoke to one of the activists who was a member of this committee, and he said, well, our idea is to introduce a double vote for people with higher education. Because this typical, exclusivist 19th century idea that you can find in John Stuart Mill, for example, at his most, elitist. And I was shocked. I mean, what's the point? I mean, you are supposed to be a grassroots democratic movement for the renewal of the country. And he said, well, but our problem is that uneducated people are voting back all these corrupt, cronies and oligarchs into power. So we have to do something about that. So my point is that with the similarities and networks and dialogues between different social movements in different countries, it is a similar situation as to the situation of a movement which is very complex in itself. In order to build, I guess that's more or less universal, in order to build a successful social movement, you have to get out of your skin. That means you have to be in dialogue with social groups that are very different from your own in order to build a larger front. And this, in order to make it, long term, of course, you have to sometimes, be able to verify your convictions, your deepest convictions. And I guess it's very much the same when it comes to building networks of solidarity between movements in different countries. It's very difficult, and it takes getting out of your skin.
Let's have a bit of a historical perspective, and maybe you would be willing to comment on that. 1968. 1968 in Paris, in Western Europe in general, was a completely different thing that was happening on the streets of Prague 1968, that was happening on the Warsaw campus 1968, and it was happening at the same time. In very general and brief terms, which of course has generalizations, the Western Europe was protesting. It was a generation protest against the lack of space for a certain generation. It was very liberal-oriented. It was more culture-based. It was all that I would generalize and call now. It's something that, from the point of Maidan, could be Occupy Wall Street. At the same time, 1968 in Prague, in Poland, it was about changing the political system. It was about something real, measure against the oppression, and of course there were efforts to communicate at that time. But now the question comes: how do you think they were successful, and how much it still resonates as just a dream to connect and to be in some solidarity between these two, happening at the same time, different spaces, for different reasons? Do you think from the time frame that we are now, they were able to communicate then, and to what extent, or this was just building up over the years? Because obviously, from today's point of view, we speak about 1968 generation that is cross-border generation and cross-border solidarity between those people who took part in both. Do you see any comparison? I mean, this historical comparison has any relevance to these questions?
Well, actually, I don't really see clearly how the comparison between the Western European and the Eastern European 68 relate. Probably it does, because we are also comparing here the Western and the Eastern context. But I think the conditions and the circumstances were totally different, and that is also another challenge for intellectual and political analysis, somehow to accept the novelty and the unpredictableness of the situation, right? Because actually we can treat it the issue as like parts of one sort of subject and or like imitations which are printed on one matrix, and whether they are communicating between each other or not. But I would like my perspective would be rather ontological than hermeneutical. Because for me, all these waves and the range of protests we see now, it reminds a bit like the Spring of Nations, right? That we saw in the 19th century, for example. So it's from my discursive perspective, it's I'm rather perceiving them as symptoms of some research, so to say. That you see now the party politics is totally corrupted. So, because you are also aimed at discussing this issue, whether the political movement can be transformed into the party or not. So it's of course not the way. It was also invented more than 100 years ago, and it has no future, that's for sure. It's very professionalized, narrow and closed political field, which has nothing to do with the real world
Political party.
Yeah, political party, yeah, no future, that's for sure. And on the other hand, we see that trade unions as a typical and traditional forms of expressing some discontent are also losing their potential. And it's a process which is actually very typical for the whole 20th century. And now we see this kind of movement. This another one like which is organized on a bit different level. So it's hard really to compare Electric Yerevan with Maidan, with White Ribbon protests. But all in general, they just indicating that people, that there is a process of searching the new political subjectivity, which is supposed to be born in probably in the nearest future. But this process is an open one. It's totally unpredictable. I mean, it's also we don't actually need to stick only to the issues, to the terms and political notions we already know, right? Our problem as if we are analyzing the current political context is rather that what we see now are already the answers, but our problem is that we don't know the questions, right? So we are dealing with something we don't know what it actually means, where it originates from. So we see somehow the results. Our task or initial political position would be rather to step back a bit and to ask proper question. Yeah? If you ask proper question, you will get the right answer in terms of materializing the political subjectivity, which is still on the go. And there is no guarantee from above or from whatever. Nobody can guarantee us the final results. It's just another attempt. Yeah? And I think, well, for me personally, to be honest, I'm really happy that Maidan happened in my life, right? It's not so common in today's world that to experience the real revolution in terms of when you have multitudes, masses who are dismantling the unjust political order. It's very emancipative also on a psychological level. So it's a long run. I mean, if we really think about it, I think the nearest perspective we can refer to is 20, 30 years, not about tomorrow. But all these movements are speaking not even about tomorrow, about today's evening. They want to be ruling just today, and Syriza or Podemos, look at these imitations of Latin American hysterics. It's really funny. It's not serious. It's not a real one. It's just symptom of time. It will be marginalized anyway. It cannot be sustained for the future.
Back to the question of Tatiana, I think that in the situation when, to the big extent, Russia is trying, for example, to corrupt EU, it is very important, this civil society solidarity. And I think that this pressure, which was made, now I'm talking first of all about the war, of course, but it's quite complicated to distinguish Maidan and war. So I think that it can play a huge role, of course, this solidarity. And if to compare with the 1960s, of course, it's much more easier, because what is common about all the current revolutions is for example, social media, which helps to communicate and to actually. Half of Maidan, it was the Facebook itself. Of course, but here in Ukraine we have, a bit. It can be a bit strange attitude towards like the global solidarity, this phrase, because it's related somehow with communism and something Soviet.
Maybe that's what we need.
Yes, but exactly. We don't need the communist international, but we need the global solidarity for sure. And actually we saw this not on the level probably of communicating and supporting other movements of Maidan, but on the level of the initiative of separate citizens or some initiative groups in other countries. I think that was very significant, this supporting of Maidan in the other countries. And it contributed a lot, actually, to the success of the, maybe not success, but to the to the fact that Maidan ended up with Yanukovych escape. I would say so. And just an interesting example, because now I'm very actively communicating with the representative of Bolotnaya movement, who is now under the home arrest in Russia, because he made the protest, the single protests by himself, just in supporting of Ukraine. And he has the history of being a part of Samoborona in Maidan, but he's purely Russian. But he came in Ukraine to support Maidan because he thought that it's his business as well. And he thinks, for example, that there can be no democracy or rule of law and all that kind of things in Russia if there will be no democracy, rule of law, and human rights in Ukraine. So especially in this, again, back to post-Soviet space, it's even more important here to support the protest movements of each other. And I remember during Maidan there was some actions in supportance of something was related with umbrella protest in Russia, something like this, and we made separate some actions related. Yes, it was related to Rain TV channel, exactly. So I think that the situation is very much interlinked, and that's why, for example, now you can see in Russia when they make some actions, some protests, they always use the Maidan rhetorics, the Ukrainian flags, all these wordings, and Maidan itself like a symbol of something which they want to gain. So yeah, that's my comment.
Some more comments from the floor? Questions, comments? Yeah.
That you called this 1st December the peaceful action, without насилля, як це?
Violence.
Without violence. But it was with violence. It was violence from the small group of people who was throwing some dangerous glass things toward police. And police, I think it was police reaction
on this small group activity. It like maybe this is the first reminding of the right sector who was staying in close to monument, and there was strong resistance from them, like in the meaning of we all will go to Valgala after this, we don't have nothing to lose. So it's difficult to say whether it was peaceful action and just police start to fight everybody, and then they remind that was some flying fire and flying this glass with this glass cans with some cucumbers from people. So it's question how, and also I remember this the way of escalation, like it happened, this throwing of some glass and people was beaten, then appear millions of people, and then it's like question of using this violence and question of responding of this, and it became to the war, like all this escalation. And by this war is like to say this patriotic, from the patriotic view, war is like saint thing. It's necessary to arise the patriotic feelings. It was very necessary to have a war. Like some writers told about this, like we need a war to establish our like Ukrainian position as a feeling by soul, we are Ukrainians.
I have to comment. I will comment, about the 1st of December. Since we were analyzing very closely all of these cases, because we were dealing with the trails, I'm sure that it was an attempt, it was a provocation. That's why I compare the situation with Bolotnaya Square, because it is very similar, when there is a provocation of the violence, and then the response of the law enforcement, the beatings, and then the arrests by some of the group of people, probably related to law enforcement, maybe. But if you will look closely on the video, you will see that. But I don't deny that it was a violence. It was. But what I meant is that it didn't cause the big wave of the mass violence. That's why I'm saying about the 16th of January, when it became totally different, when not the group of some people, they are obvious radicals, and I'm not sure that they wasn't used by law enforcement indeed, or by people in the presidential administration. But in the middle of January, it became really a business of the whole Maidan. Generally speaking. So what I meant is that they probably some group of the people, they tried to make the escalation, but they did not manage to do that, because yes, there was this situation on Bankova Street, but on the same time we had the huge amount of people, thousands of people on Maidan, and they were totally peaceful, and it was after the violence. So that was what I meant.
I guess this would be also closing comments for the discussion. Vasyl?
But closing commenting what? I mean, because I didn't get the point. For the discussion in general.
If you don't want to respond directly. Yeah, we did not get the second part that much.
Yeah, because I think we have to be really precise when using like the terms Maidan, war, and that Ukrainians were declaring some war already during Maidan to raise patriotic feelings and to increase some grade of the discourse. It's really, maybe you are mixing countries because we are not Russia.
I mean, using violence, you
But
You
it
move.
doesn't mean that you create war. It's just different thing.
You're ready to participate in the war.
Oh, yes. Yeah, but to use violence in the because
You haven't used violence, no?
it's a personal question.
Yes.
Yeah, I did. Unfortunately, not only once, but you see, it's like really okay. Let's differentiate that way.
I mean during Maidan.
So there is a violence of the civic nature, civic violence, which was of course full of different contradictions during Maidan because it's never a prepared process. We are not dealing with clear examples. It's like reality in its raw pieces. Of course, there were some culminations totally provoked, but I don't like this to follow this kind of conspiracy line. It doesn't make much sense. I'm rather analyzing on the structural or methodological level. So of course there were like different shades of the violence used on Maidan, but on the other hand we cannot judge only, for example, that on the 1st of January 2014 we had a torch march organized by Svoboda and other guys of that kind. So it's not, it was the case, sure, but it's not telling the whole story. It's just misleading in totally different direction. And if you are not differentiating the civic violence, which is aimed at re-establishing, restarting, and hopefully, but it's not unfortunately the Ukrainian case, rethinking the institutions, the social basic institutions. So it's one kind of violence, and another thing is the state-provoked violence, the intervention with the whole military apparatus, together with the media and other ones, when the whole state is on the go. It's just different levels of violence, and you cannot go easily from one to another. We are just mixing terms. Let's be precise. That is the task of our School of Abducted Europe. Be precise and understand what we actually speak out. Because if we are mistaken in terms, it just leads us to nothing. Because otherwise we are just speaking about different problems. So the same, you cannot say that there is a sexual identity and there is a national identity. And if you are mixing them, like for example some guys from Svoboda do, you are really getting some problems. So it's just different levels. You cannot press them into one. Let's first define words. That's what I mean.
I thought violence which provoke blood. Sorry?
For the closing of the discussion.
For the closing remark, I would like to sort of divert a little bit from the question of violence and come back to the question of political parties and trade unions. Because Vasyl said that political parties and trade unions are actually out of touch with reality, and what actually matters is this spontaneous grassroots social movement, all-encompassing social movement. But it is very difficult to run a country for a social movement. It's really impossible. And I partially agree with your take on Podemos. Of course, it is an attempt to create a political party in a top-down manner. I mean, the original members of Podemos signed this declaration, which then made Podemos possible, are from just one institute of political science in Madrid. They all knew each other, so it's kind of elite that's trying to put a certain framework onto the social movement. It works to a certain extent, but I'm not saying this is the way to go. But I don't agree that political parties and trade unions necessarily have to be out of touch with reality. Well, the biggest lesson from post-1989 political scene in Poland is that if you ignore class divisions, if you try to create catch-all parties that are sort of, aiming at becoming sort of, proto-social movements. I mean, trying to attract as many voters from different social strata and different social classes as possible, you end up with the far right or at least extreme right taking over and exploiting this class sentiments. And this is the lesson of peace. Peace would not be possible if it wasn't for ignoring certain class interests in the 90s, for example. And this is a more or less universal phenomenon, I would say. I mean, if you ignore class interests and legitimate class concerns, you end up with far-right substituting for class issues with their own rhetoric. This has happened in America, this has happened in Poland, and this will happen, or it already happened in Ukraine as well. So I don't believe that political parties and trade unions do necessarily have to be out of that with reality. You should have to create political parties and trade unions that are basically down to earth and respond to legitimate class concerns of the people. But to say, political parties are over, will just make politics as a social movement, well, I guess it's not very efficient in the long run.
I will just express the hope that we will not need another revolution to have the real political parties and to finish the age of de facto one-party system which we have now. So that's my big hope, and that's the work we have to do.
Right, and on this note, we close the debate. Thank you for staying and listening and freezing.